Welcome back, Focus Learners. We've got a really profound explainer lined up for you today. We're going to unpack a brilliant essay by Denzel Kenobi called Beyond the Chains. It's fascinating because Kenobi actually weaves American history together with ancient biblical scripture to basically challenge everything we think we know about the timeline of Black freedom in the U.S. Let's get right into it.
So, for a lot of folks, the story of slavery just neatly wraps up in 1865, right? Well, Kenobi argues that Black freedom absolutely wasn't instantaneous. He draws this incredibly powerful parallel to biblical liberation. Think about it. When the Israelites walked out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea wasn't the end of their story. It was actually the beginning of 40 years in the wilderness. That legal release, it wasn't the moment of actual freedom.
To guide us through all this, here is our roadmap. First, we'll look at the myth of 1865. Then, censoring liberation. Third, the evolving yokes. Fourth, the enduring scars. And finally, the Jubilee Ode.
Okay, Part 1. The Myth of 1865 Beyond December 6th. The source text really pushes us to deconstruct this misconception that the 13th Amendment was some absolute end to oppression. And to truly grasp what that means, we need to sit with the number 246. From 1619 to 1865, America sustained 246 agonizing years of legalized servitude. To put that into perspective, that is a period of intense human suffering longer than the entire existence of the United States as an independent nation.
Kenobi starkly compares this massive timeline to the biblical bondage of the Israelites in Egypt, which Genesis notes as roughly 4 centuries. And honestly, when you add the century of legalized oppression that followed American slavery, the timeline approaches that exact same biblical span. So, when Black preachers historically referred to America as Egypt, they weren't just reaching for a catchy metaphor. They were literally reading their own lives in the text with, well, devastating precision.
Moving on to Part 2. Censoring the Liberation, the Slave Bible of 1807.
Now, oppressors were entirely aware of the inherent power in this biblical liberation narrative, and that led to a pretty shocking historical reality. In 1807, British missionaries actually published what they called the Slave Bible. They surgically removed roughly 90% of the Old Testament and about half of the New Testament. Gone was the Exodus cry of "Let my people go." And what did they keep? Passages like Ephesians demanding that servants obey their masters. As the essay points out, this level of censorship was essentially a confession. They knew the full canon was a direct threat to their entire system.
But here's the thing. The censorship failed. Enslaved Christians fought back by reconstructing those forbidden texts through memory and oral tradition. The source vividly describes how spirituals essentially became a smuggled canon. Songs like Go Down Moses carried forbidden escape instructions right past the overseers. Whatever the Slave Bible cut out, these clandestine gatherings, known as hush harbors, simply sang right back into existence.
This brings us to Part 3, the evolving yokes, a century of illusion.
The real core argument of the essay is that yes, physical chains were removed in 1865, but new systems of racial control were forged almost instantly. Right off the bat came the Black Codes, forcing newly freed people back into exploitative conditions. That was followed by convict leasing, which exploited a loophole in the 13th Amendment to force brutal, unpaid labor. After that came Jim Crow segregation, and then, well into the 20th century, you had systemic redlining, which actively prevented Black families from building wealth. So freedom was just continually redefined, and in the process, continually denied. To frame this era, the source points back to prophetic texts. Isaiah condemns those who literally write injustice into law, saying, "Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees." The essay illustrates how the prophets historically condemned the exact same maneuvers used in systems like the Black Codes or convict leasing. It turns out writing injustice directly into the legal code is one of the oldest sins on record.
Of course, enforcing these new yokes required immense political suppression and racial terror. The essay cites some really stark data from the Equal Justice Initiative. They documented nearly 4,500 racial terror lynchings of Black people between 1877 and 1950. These were public spectacles of violence, carried out with total impunity, just to ensure that these new systems of control held firm.
Which actually brings us to a pretty striking number, 60. Kenobi asks us to consider that true legal access, the ability to vote without suppression and access public spaces equally, which was achieved via the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965, is only about 60 years old. That is entirely within a single living memory. Think about it.
Your parents or your grandparents likely lived right through this shift.
All right, part 4, the enduring scars, generational trauma, and persistent disparities.
Kenobi's essay firmly rejects the idea that slavery was just a long time ago, and people should just get over it. Instead, he points to some glaring, present-day evidence. If you look at the 2022 median wealth gap, a white household holds over $284,000 compared to just under $45,000 for a black household. He presents this not as some random accident, but as the literal mathematical arithmetic of centuries of exclusion from home ownership and inheritance. It traces straight back to policies like redlining.
And it goes beyond just wealth. These enduring scars show up in educational inequalities, from underfunded schools, and in profound health disparities too. For example, the source cites CDC data showing that Black adults are 60% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes. This is linked to chronic stress, lack of healthcare access, and the environmental legacy of segregation. Plus, research on epigenetics actually suggests that the physical toll of this generational trauma can literally echo down through descendants.
Kenobi connects these modern scientific realities of intergenerational trauma directly back to Scripture. He uses Psalm 137 as the Bible's own testimony that the trauma of captivity doesn't just magically end the exact second someone is released. The Israelites sang that psalm of weeping for generations after Babylon fell. It shows that the blast radius of oppression carries forward a long, long time.
Which leads us into part 5, the Jubilee Ode, restitution as true freedom.
This brings us to the essay's ultimate argument, which is that true freedom is simply incomplete without restitution. See, ancient Israel's law contained this radical economic reset in Leviticus 25 known as the Year of Jubilee. Every 50th year, debts were canceled, the bonded were released, and dispossessed land was actually returned. The essay points out this fascinating historical irony here. America literally engraved the Jubilee verse, proclaimed liberty throughout all the land, right on the Liberty Bell, but completely skipped the actual policy of economic restitution.
The crucial point here is summarized perfectly in a quote from Isaiah, that ye break every yoke. That is the thematic climax of Kenobi's essay. He's saying the 13th Amendment merely unlocked a single chain, but the biblical standard of justice? That demands the breaking of every single yoke. The black codes, Jim Crow, redlining, breaking them so they can never be laid on again. According to the text, a nation that refuses restoration hasn't truly repented.
All of this leaves us with a final, really provocative thought from the source. The essay argues that memory is not the enemy of healing. Memory is exactly where healing starts. So we really have to ask ourselves, especially after looking at the true extended timeline of this history, can the path to a truly equitable future even begin without a shared and honest telling of the story? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, Focused Learners. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you next time.